or pick up a caffeine habit. Here we go. Now it's time for components. So up until now, some of you being exceptions, we've really only dealt with modifying the entire objects, but you can modify just components of the objects. All right, I did briefly mention last week, I'm just going to delete all of those and create a cube, that 3D objects are made up of various components. They are made up of, oh, that was weird, vertices, okay, points in space. Those points in space are then connected by an edge, and then 3 to 4 or sometimes more edges form a face. Okay, this would be a face. A cube is made up of 6 faces, all equal sides. As we're beginning to build models, try to keep everything as all quad 4-sided faces. Right? There are instances where triangles are okay, but for edge flow, ease of modification of these objects, and deformation when we get into animation, rigging, things of that nature, quads are the way to go. It just makes everything smoother and cleaner. It can be a little bit trickier to, model in that fashion, but the benefits far outweigh the pain of it, at least up front. Okay, once you get used to modeling in this way, it's easy. It just takes some time to get there. So we've got all of these components, and every primitive, I don't know why I added another cube, it's not what I wanted. Every primitive has those. They're in different shapes, but they're all the same sort of thing. All right, vertices, edges, and faces. So how do you actually select these vertices, edges, and faces? I've done it a few times, but I haven't told you how. So let me tell you how. Select an object, hold down the right mouse button, and then you've got this context-sensitive menu. I believe they call them marking menus in Maya. And as you move the mouse around, you highlight over various commands, or you also have this menu that gives you a bunch more options. As I mentioned before, there are just menus on menus on menus in Maya. I know it can be overwhelming. That's why I'm only really covering what we're using at the moment. So right-click, hold down the right mouse button, and just move your mouse over to vertex. And now you can see you've got little purple, magenta squares that as you hover over them, they turn red. And then as you left-click to select them, they turn yellow. You can select multiple by holding down the Shift key, or left-click dragging across. Much like objects, if you left-click and drag across, it will select everything, even the hidden ones. So just keep that in mind. You can double-click on the Move tool, and actually, I guess it would be Selection tool, and turn on camera-based selection, so then you can only select what is visible to the camera, and the ones that are hidden behind the object you won't select. All right. And then you can just click on the Tool Settings tab, and that will collapse. You can also select edges and faces, or you can go to Multi, and you'll be able to select all of them. All right. I tend to just work in one at a time, faces, edges, or vertices. The way that the marking menus work is they are kind of gesture-based, so you don't have to wait for the menu to open and then go over to select vertex, and you don't have to be super exact on it. You can just right-click and drag, and it'll go to vertex. If you remember that left is vertex, and up is edge, and down is face, you can very quickly jump between them, and right, oh, that was UV, there's object in there somewhere. Yeah, up and to the right is object mode, down and to the right is multi. Okay, so there is room in Maya to work very fast. You just have to learn the interface. For right now, don't worry about doing it so fast you can't see it. Just hold down the right mouse button, figure out what you want, and release. Once you have a component selected, you can manipulate it the same way that you do objects overall. Select a face, and I can hit the W key to bring up my move manipulator, and I can move in any direction. And you can see that when I move one face, it also affects the faces that are connected to it. It's not affecting the bottom face, but because this face is composed of vertices and edges, any other face that uses those vertices and edges also gets affected. I can also scale the face. So now I've got a taper. I can also rotate the face any which way that I want. Okay, the difference here is in my channel box, I can't, say rotate this much. All right, I can't, it's not like the whole object where I can move it to 5 units or whatever. If I want to do something like that, then up in the status bar, I think this is called. Okay, there's a little section right here between sign in and all of your render options. If you expand that out, we've got 3 fields, an X, a Y, and a Z field. From there, I can say, all right, I want to move this in the Y direction 5 units. 5, enter, and now it's gone up 5 units. If I have rotation selected, and I want to rotate this, 15 degrees along the x-axis, say negative 15, tilt it back. I guess I do want positive 15. Oops. Okay, now I've tilted that forward, and it's going around the pivot point. So wherever your pivot point is what it will use as its pivot. Okay, that's kind of how it has its name. And then the same thing works for scale. Now I'm going to undo a couple times so I'm not completely weird with it. So that's faces. You can move vertices. You can't rotate vertices or scale them because it's just a single point in space. But you can select 2 vertices and you can scale them closer together. Okay, it's the same as if you were to select the edge and just scale that in the same direction. Okay. Same effect, 2 different ways of doing it. Yeah, so that is the basic manipulation of vertices, edges, and faces. Now we can also, I'm going to jump over here to this sphere, and I'm going to go to edge. If you want to select multiple components, you don't just have to hold down the left mouse button or hold down shift and click around. All right, that's a very tedious way to select if you want to select this whole loop. It's called an edge loop. It's a continuous ring of edges around an object. If you want to select the whole edge loop, just double click on an edge and it will select that whole loop. Okay. If I select on a vertical one, you can see now with the sphere, it doesn't go all the way through. And the reason for that is at the poles of the sphere, we have triangles. All right, so there's not a defined path all the way around the sphere in that direction. You can also select face loops. So I go to face. Now if I go to face and double click on a face, it's going to select the whole object. If I want to select a face loop, you need to select one face, hold down shift, and then double click on the face next to it. And that will select the whole face loop. And then from there, you can scale it. Now be careful when you do something like this. Right now, the scale manipulator is the Z direction is what's highlighted, so it's only going to scale in one direction. Okay. If I want to make sure you have the center selected if you want to scale in all directions. Again, that's select one face, hold down shift, and double click on the face next to it. You'll select the whole loop. If it doesn't select the whole loop, there's a good chance that you've got either faces aren't connected or there's some hidden geometry. And it's a clue that there might be a problem. Although I was also running into the problem at home. Again, this is Maya 2018, but I was running into the problem where if I was in Move or Select, I could easily select a face loop. But if I had the Scale tool activated, it wouldn't select the face loop. I don't know, it seemed like a bug for me, but it seems to be working fine here. If you want to select only part of a loop, select one face, hold down Shift, and double-click at the end of it, which would be, let's say, here. And then I'm just going to select everything in between those. All right, and I can continue. I can hold down Shift and double-click here, and it's going to extend that selection and then to there. Okay, so I can select just part of a face loop that way. Vertices work the same way. You select one vertex, hold down Shift, double-click on the next vertex. It will select them in a line or in the path. I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, you can't really go off a path, off an edge. Otherwise, it'll just select the whole thing. All right, but you can also select a loop of or a ring of vertices the same way. Select one, hold down Shift, double-click. It'll select the whole ring. Okay. So that's how we select what we already have on an object. But what if we want more detail on an object? Well, then we need to start adding geometry. And there's a few different ways you can do this. There's more than a few. There's a number of different ways you can do this. Today I just want to focus on two: extruding and adding edge loops. And I'm going to start with the second one, adding edge loops. So if I go into edge mode, which makes a certain amount of sense that you need to be in edge mode to add edge loops. There's a couple ways that we can do this. We've got three menus here when we're in the modeling menu set: Mesh, Edit Mesh, and Mesh Tools. If you play around with all of these options, I promise you will get into trouble in delightful ways. I encourage you to play around with these menus. Just make sure you're saving if it's anything that matters. But we've got in Edit Mesh, is it in Edit Mesh? No, we've got Delete Edge. You can see that these are in sections. We've got Components, Vertex, Edge, Face, Curve. In Mesh, we've got Combine Options, Remesh, Transfer, Mirror. And then Mesh Tools, we've got, there it is, Insert Edge Loop. It's in Mesh Tools. Remember, I think I mentioned this last week. If you click on this like double dash line here at the top of any menu, that menu will break off, which can be useful. You can also find the Insert Edge Loop tool. I believe it's on here. I never use these icons, which I think I'm putting on very prominent display. Collapse, target weld, quad draw. Maybe it's not on here. I thought it was. Doesn't matter. Here's the way that I do it. In edge mode, with a edge selected, I'm losing my ability to talk. Hold down the Shift key and right-click, and now we have a whole different set of context-sensitive menu options. Okay. Pulling this up is always going to be Shift right-click, but depending on if you're an edge, face, vertex, component, sculpting, whatever mode you're in, these options will change. But we've got a number of commonly used tools here. And if we go down the list, we have Insert Edge Loop tool. All right, and we've got some options next to it. So I'm going to click on those options first. And it opens up our tool settings here. We've got a button to reset the tool to make sure that however it was set before, we're at a consistent starting spot. Then we've got relative distance from edge, equal distance from edge, multiple edge loops. We can change how many edge loops we add at a time, smoothing angle. All right, so we've got some options. I'm going to come back to these options. First, let's just add an edge loop and see what happens. So with the tool selected, I'm just going to click on an edge, and it will add an edge loop perpendicular to that edge. Okay, you need to have a consistent ring of faces in order for this edge loop to go all the way around. but it also gives you this dashed green highlight. And I'm still holding down the left mouse button, clicking and dragging, and I can define where I want that to go. So if I need to add some detail to the left side of this cube, I can drag this over. And now I'm going to hit Q to bring up my selection tool again. And now I've got more vertices, edges, and faces that I can manipulate and add more detail with. Okay, so that's just adding a single edge loop. I'm going to come over to this sphere. Let's work on this one. So I'm going to go back to edge. I'm going to shift right click, hold down the right mouse button, and go back to insert edge loop tool. Let's look at the difference between relative distance from edge and equal distance from edge. And to do this, I think I need something a little bit more irregular. So I'm going to I'm going to go back to the cube here. I'm going to select a face or an edge. I'm just going to bring that up. All right. So I'm going to go back to my insert edge loop tool. And I want to add an edge loop that goes across here. It's going to be horizontal mostly. If I choose relative distance from edge and click and drag, you can see that it's not even. All right, that might be a little tricky to see. Let me just try to make this a little bit more obvious for you. Let me jump to the side view, front view. All right, this is a longer distance than this distance, and that's relative. So what it's doing is let's say it's maybe 10% of the distance here to here of the whole length of that edge. And then it's doing the same thing. This is 10%. All right, it's not 0.2 units. It's 10%. If I go equal distance from edge, so I'm going to undo that, and now choose equal distance from edge. Then it's going to mirror whichever edge that I click closest to. All right, so now it's perfectly even. If I want it to be equal to this edge, then I just click on the bottom end of that edge, and now it's flat, and I can drag that back up top here. Okay. So if I click on the top half of the edge, it's going to mirror that top geometry. If I click on the bottom half of the edge, it's going to mirror the bottom geometry. Okay, so that's equal distance from edge. And then again, relative distance from edge. You can see how it's more flat towards the bottom, and it conforms more to the top geometry as I move towards the top. So that's relative versus equal. I tend to stick with equal distance from edge. I just like things lining up like that, but your mileage may vary. Finally, we have multiple edge loops. So here we can set our number of edge loops. So by default it's 2. I click and hold the left mouse button, and it just keeps them right there. Okay, it keeps them in the center. If I uncheck the equal modifier, nope, that's not true at all. I thought there was a way to just slide these around, and I can't remember what that is. Maybe not. But you can set this to any number. So let's say we want 5 edge loops. They will be equally spaced. I like to use multiple edge loops is actually set it to 1. This way it will place an edge loop exactly in the center. So I need to divide something exactly in half. Then that is how I will do it. Okay. Oops. That's weird. Oh, let me turn those back on. That's why. Okay. So add it exactly in the center. So that's adding edge loops. Once you add those edge loops, now you can modify them. So I can move them up and down, you know, obviously the same move, rotate, and scale. You can also slide the edge. So, oops. If I select, let's say, just these, let's just select these back two edges here. I'm going to delete this sphere. Oops. Delete. Okay, I'm just going to select these back two edges. And then shift right click, go down to slide edge tool. I've got some options here: relative, absolute, use snapping. I'm going to turn off use snapping. And then I can just middle click and drag, and we'll slide the edge up and down. Okay, and you can select multiple edges. You can do it with just one edge. Okay, and it will just follow whatever geometry you have. So I can select these, you know, however I want to do it. So that's slide edge. One more thing that I want to show you with edge loops, and then we're going to move on to extruding. So we've got sliding edges, we've got inserting edge loops. The last one that I want to show you is the offset edge loop tool. So again, I'm going to, with an edge selected, shift right click, and go down to the offset edge loop tool. I'll bring up the options here so we can see them. There's not really anything. Okay, you can choose relative distance from edge or equal distance from edge the same way that we can with the regular insert edge loop tool. I'm going to set mine to equal distance from edge. Enter tool and close. Okay, so now I've got that tool selected. The way offset edge loop works is you pick one edge and it will add two edge loops on either side, or one on either side. So I've got this vertical one. I'm going to click on the side of it. Whoops, just kidding. I'm going to click on the actual edge and then drag my mouse to get the distance that I want, and then release. And there we go. I've added two equal edge loops. So you select whatever edge you want to add the edge loops around, click and drag, and there you go. A note about adding edge loops: don't just add a bunch at once. Generally speaking, whenever you add geometry, you're going to want to manipulate that geometry immediately and then add more as you go. If you just add a bunch at once and you're trying to create anything smooth or even, it's going to be very difficult to do. You know, for instance, if I want to add, I'm going to delete that. I'm going to just add a new cube. All right, so let's say I want to create the top of this cube kind of swooping up a little bit, or even just a straight diagonal, but I know I need a bunch of geometry. If I just go and try to add a bunch of edges, let's say we're just going to add 4. Okay. And then I go back in and bring these edges up here, and then I'm going to bring these edges up here and try to get this to be in a fairly straight line. It can be done, but it's really not a great way to do it. Instead, if before you add all that geometry, you get the object as close to what you want it to look like as possible, then you add some geometry. Actually, I'm just going to do multiple in one, so it's perfectly in the center. Okay, now I can select this and move it down a little bit. Okay, and then I want to add a couple more edge loops, so I'll add one here. And now I'm going to bring that down, so I'm just getting this very slight arc. It's going to be a much smoother way to do it. All right, and that way I'm not guessing about how much geometry I need. You know, I can look at this and be like, well, I didn't actually need this center edge loop. Okay, so now I have to delete it. But it's only one edge loop, whereas if you add 7 at a time, and then you have to delete a bunch more. But that brings me to a very important thing. How do you delete objects? Well, if you just want to delete an object, in object mode you just hit the delete key, all right, and then it disappears forever. But if you want to delete components, it gets a little bit trickier. So you can delete faces, easy enough. Select a face, hit delete, it's gone. All right, now you've got a hole in your mesh. If you want to delete edges and not have a hole in your mesh, you might be tempted to do the exact same thing. Select an edge, hit delete. It's gone. However, what you've just done is you've created a 6-sided face. All right, and you've got an edge. You still have a vertex right here on the side. All right, you can kind of see it here, but let's say you added an edge loop here. All right, and then you deleted it. You don't want it. It looks like now you're back to where you were. But if you go into vertex mode, you can see you've got a ring of vertices around it. And if you move one of them, things get kind of weird. Because look at this face. What is this face? As you rotate around, you can see it's got this weird distortion. And it's got this, it looks like an edge, but it's not actually an edge. What it's doing is Maya doesn't know what that's supposed to be. Okay, you're telling it a face is supposed to be planar. Right? And so by doing this, you're creating a non-planar face, and Maya has to just kind of guess on how it's supposed to be resolved. Whereas if you have the proper edge flow, it'll figure out, oh, you want it to have a crease here and bend here. So when you're deleting edges, I'm going to go into multi-view so you can see this a little bit better. Okay, when you're deleting edges, you don't want to hit just delete. You want to shift delete. Or no, sorry, control delete. There it is. Control delete will delete the vertices as well. Okay, and will leave you with whole edges and faces remaining. Okay, that's an important point. When you're deleting edges, control delete will actually remove the edges and the vertices that they were associated with. Is all the edge loop tools. I'm going to delete that object. I'm going to add a new cube. Now let's talk about extruding, which extruding and edge loops are the two kind of tools I use the most to add geometry. And what extruding is, I'm always reminded of when I was little. I had a Play-Doh it was an extruder, like different shapes you would put on the nozzle, and then you would force the Play-Doh through it, and then it would come out in the shape of a star or a circle or a square or whatever shape you put on it. It's kind of like what extruding is here in 3D. So if you select a face, you can also extrude edges, but primarily I extrude faces. You can go up to, let's see, mesh tools, no, edit mesh. Nope, just kidding. There it is. Components, extrude. See, Command E is the shortcut. You've got some options here, which we'll get to in a second. You can also shift right click and extrude face. And then in Maya 2018, there's a new feature where if you just hold down the shift button and hover over one of the manipulator directions, you can see it says extrude. Then you can click and drag. That's great. It's a really fast way to do it, but I don't want to do it that way just yet because there is some features that doesn't offer. So I'm going to do it the shift right click extrude face. Okay, now I've got some more options here. First, my manipulator changes, and it shows me a rotation option, moving and scaling all at once. And then I've got this little window here with a few more options. We have thickness. So if you hover over each of these words, you see the manipulator changes to like a left and right arrow. Middle click and drag, and you can see there's thickness. Oops, let me set that back to 0. We've got local translate Z, which are very similar to thickness. I've seen reports of local translate Z being more reliable, but you can see they do the same thing. Offset, which is adding a taper, so you can either have it small or larger. If you go too far, you get this weird distortion. That's not a good thing. Don't do that. Okay. You've got divisions, which is how many subdivisions you want to add in this extrusion. Okay, and then we've got keep faces together, which I'll show you what that does here in a second. I just want to make one note about the divisions. Again, this is a place where you can accidentally add too much geometry at once. If you have a plan and you know what you're doing, sure, go ahead and add 5 or 9 or 10 or whatever. But generally, don't add too much geometry too fast. But oftentimes, I will add, I guess it'll be 3 divisions. It's 2 edge loops. And the reason for that is that I can go in edge mode, select these 2 edge loops. Whoops. Okay. Got those selected all the way around. And then because this is symmetrical, I'm just going to scale them in along the X and the Z axis. And what it does is it just gives me a really nice, even, round kind of shape to it. All right. So I like to do 2 edge loops when I'm going for that, that shape. All right, the last thing you saw in there was keep faces together. And to show you that, I'm going to bring up a cylinder. I'm going to scale it down this way. I'm going to move it over here. And I'm going to select that face loop. Okay, I did that kind of fast. Just to step back through it. I created a cylinder. Then I scaled it down, so R to scale. I just scaled it along the Y-axis, so about like that. W to bring up the move tool, move it over. All right, right-click, hold it down, go to face select mode, and then select one face, hold down Shift, double-click on the face next to it, and I've selected that whole face loop. Okay, that's how I did that. Now I'm going to Shift right-click and go to Extrude Face. There we go. I'm going to adjust the thickness here. Something like that looks good. And now, keep faces together is on. If I turn that off, that's what that does. Okay, so now each individual face is its own extrusion. Okay, together it's basically expanding the disc. Turn that off, it's starting to look a little bit more kind of like a gear. Not quite, but kind of. And then I can combine that with an offset. Hold down Control to make that a finer tuned control. Now they all taper down a little bit. There's one other option here in this window which is kind of invisible, but it's this light blue circle pie thing that's happening here. This is your drag speed sensitivity. All right, so the more full the pie is, the more the faster the drag speed is. So if I go all the way down to like just one little slice and click and drag, okay, it's pretty fine-tuned control, and I'm not moving too far. If I click all the way up and drag that, now it's just out of hand. Okay, I can't really do that fine-tuned control. So I'm not sure what the default is. Whatever gives you the control that you want, and obviously you can adjust that on the fly.